Great. Judy, it is so good to have you here today. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and chat.
You're welcome. I'm so thankful for the invitation, Jordan.
Yeah, awesome. Appreciate it. Well, hey, you are no stranger to suffering, and I just wanted to thank you for being willing to share a bit about that with us today, and how you've been on a journey where you've experienced some pretty significant physical suffering, like going through cancer and other things. But also you've mentioned along that journey that your physical suffering maybe more profoundly has brought about some deep inner pain and inner suffering that goes beyond that. And so why don't you just start off by sharing with us a bit about your journey with cancer and maybe some of the things that has revealed about other areas of struggle that you've gone through.
Okay, so if I tell you how long this happened, you'll know exactly how old I am, so that's kind of why I'm hesitating to go there. But
you're giving away the secret.
20 years ago, when I was turning 40.
Okay, what? That's insane. How do you stay looking so young? That's my next question, because I want to do what you do.
I wanted to do something that would mark my 40th year. I wanted something that would help me remember it in a way that doing something that would be dramatic enough that I would remember it, to make as a marker, right? What I didn't expect is that I would be diagnosed with cancer at the age of 40.
Wow, okay.
So it wasn't exactly what I had planned, but it was definitely a marker moment in my life. And I mean, obviously when you receive a cancer diagnosis, it's like pulling the rug from under your feet. Yeah. It's a big word. It has a lot of very serious connotations, and often people think of death because so many people die from it. And so it was no different for me. I still remember the day the doctor called me. I was at home with my daughters. They were small, and it was in the evening, and the phone call, I received the phone call from my doctor. And he said, "Judy, I'm sorry to tell you that the tumor you have is malignant. You have cancer." And it was such a stunning moment for me. But I remember that night trying to tuck my girls into bed and not let them know how sad I was, how in pain I was, and how scared I was. And I tucked them into bed, and I remember going to one of our windows and looking out and saying I was saying this to God. I says, "This is just like you," which is a pretty dramatic response, because inside of me I was feeling like God was angry at me, that for some reason I had done something, and so he was punishing me. And so the beginning of that journey was very turbulent, because it brought out some very deep emotions about my relationship with God in the first place. Wow. But it was also, that was one thing that was just was pronounced for me, is how much I felt that he didn't love me. Ironically, it was through my cancer experience that I discovered how much he did.
Okay, which for a lot of people would feel like that's what proves that God doesn't love them, or that he doesn't exist. Like, why would he allow me to get cancer or sick? But for you, it almost proved the opposite.
It did, because in my journey with cancer, I discovered a God who really wanted to be involved in my life. He really wanted to participate in the things that I was suffering with. And he wanted to bring healing in my heart, because there were a lot of things in my life that, for example, bitterness, that I understood from him, that was the greatest cancer than the tumor that I had, that my issue with bitterness and resentment was more serious than the tumor I had.
Right.
And so in my journey with cancer, God's invitation was, invite me into this, because I want to bring wholeness to your life, and not just address this cancer.
Right.
I want to restore you as a person, because I love you. Wow. Right? I want to see you whole. I want to see you well, but not in just the physical level, but on all levels.
Yeah.
And so my experience with, or my journey with cancer has brought out a lot of very good things, a lot of insights into my life, and a lot of opportunities for me to grow as a person and in my understanding of God and what He had for my life. So that was, I would say that was one of the moments of the deepest suffering that I went through. Up until that point, that had been one of the hardest things to go through. But I also came out of it a very different person. I always tell Ray that he got a new wife because of cancer, because of what God was doing in my life.
How long was that journey with cancer?
Well, I was diagnosed 20 years ago, and I had a reoccurrence about 2 years after that. So I've had a total of 3 tumors. And since then I haven't had anything. So.
And what was the treatments that you went through medically?
So that part of my journey with cancer was that I wanted God to guide me in the direction that I should take in my cancer. And it was an invitation to kind of step off the cliff and trust that He could lead me forward, because the path that He led me down was not, it was the path less traveled.
Wasn't the conventional
path.
It
was not the conventional path. And His constant invitation was, do you trust me? Do you trust me to take care of you? Do you trust that I am the great physician? Do you trust that I know what's wrong with your body and I know how to fix it? And so, I had surgery. But when the time came to decide, should I do what everyone else was doing with the chemo and the radiation, I just felt no peace about it. And I felt that I wanted to make choices that would strengthen my body and not weaken it. Right? I firmly believe that God has given us an immune system that's supposed to work and to fight against disease. And so I wanted to do everything I could to strengthen the immune system to fight. And so God brought I have so many God moments in my journey, and I can't tell you all of them, but there were so many moments where I just knew that it was a crucial decision-making moment. And God was bringing someone into my life out of the blue often and say, try this, or maybe you should go in this direction. And when I went in those directions, I just felt so much peace. One, because I knew it wasn't harming my body. And secondly, because I don't feel that God is limited in the way that He can heal us. Right.
I think a similar experience for myself during a season of pretty intense burnout. My mental health was completely shot, and different people recommending that I take medication for it, antidepressants or whatnot, and which I totally support for people who need to or people who go that route. I think they are helpful for certain aspects of it. But for me, I just sensed God saying that He had some deeper healing instead. And so I almost did, and I had it ready just in case it was needed, but ultimately I stayed away from it because God took me on a different journey of uncovering a lot of my brokenness that brought me to that burnout place. And so I can totally get that, where God can work through all these means, but following Him in that, where if He's taking you in an unconventional route, it's well, I'm just going to have to trust the Lord on this one.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so often people, they ask God for His perspective on things after they've tried everything else. And I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to start with Him, and then whoever else He brings into my life, but not put my trust in a treatment or in another person, but keep my trust focused on God.
Like the woman who bled for 12 years and went to every physician and everything, and no one could heal her, and then she touched the hem of Jesus' robe, and yeah, I remember that story. It's a good one.
That one marked me because they just touched the hem of His garment and they were healed. And I remember praying that, Jesus, I just want to touch the hem of your garment, right? But I would also say that this, what I was saying before is that cancer was an opportunity that God used to address a lot of things in my life.
Okay.
And part of one of my prayers, one of my frequent prayers was, God, I want to understand why I had cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't want to make the same mistakes. I want my body to be healed. I want to be well.
Mm.
And I already mentioned that he addressed bitterness, right?
Yeah.
But he also brought people into my life who prayed for me during this time.
Mm.
And there have been several moments in my life during cancer and post-cancer where God has allowed some pause moments in my life.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of like stripped everything away, and it's been a time just between me and God.
Mm. Yeah.
And those have been times of just deep healing in my heart.
Yeah.
And where people have also been involved and have been praying with me. And two good friends of mine spent some time with me, kind of combing through my life from as far back as I could remember to the present, to kind of deal with some of the things that that needed to be resolved between me and God. So some of them were sins that had not been confessed, or some of them were just deep hurts that I had never brought to God and said, you know, can you heal this, right? Or just acknowledging them. And one of those was rejection. And I was
Interesting.
And I was trying to understand where the root of rejection had kind of taken root in my life. Like where had it started?
Mm-hmm.
And through praying with these people, when we went back, to the beginning of my life, one of the things that God brought up was when I was in my mother's womb, when my mom was pregnant of me, and my mom will acknowledge this, so this isn't any big secret, but we've worked it out.
Yeah.
But before I was born, my mom was pregnant with my baby brother, and after he was born, he lived about 10 days, but died in a hospital in Brazil from hospital neglect. Basically, he was exposed to cold air, and he died. And so after my mom lost my baby brother, she got pregnant of me. And because she had suffered such a great loss, losing her baby, she was afraid to attach herself to me. Because she was afraid that maybe God would also take me.
Right.
And so to protect herself, that was her own hurt.
Right.
She didn't attach herself to me.
Yeah.
And so I grew up with this sense that I was never really accepted by my mom, never really loved by my mom. And I didn't understand the why of it.
Yeah.
Until as an adult, I found out this story about my mom's experience with me and when she was pregnant. And so rejection had been following me my whole life.
From infancy.
From infancy.
Yeah.
And I was so afraid of being rejected. And I would say that one of the most, we create like self-defense to protect ourselves from things that hurt us.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And for me, in the area of rejection, I had just developed this skill of rejecting other people before they rejected me.
Right. Yeah. If you close the door on them, then you protect yourself from ever having it shut on your face. Yeah.
The problem is that you miss out on relationship.
Yeah.
If you're always rejecting people, if you're afraid of being rejected, you don't take those risks.
You kind of lock yourself into a room, just have all these walls around you. Yeah.
And so it was around my cancer time, so when I was about 40, that I experienced, I would say up until that point, my most painful moment of rejection. It hadn't been so much my mom then, this was my best friend.
during your cancer time?
It all happened kind of simultaneously.
Okay,
Yeah.
wow. That's a lot of things colliding.
It was. There were a number of things that all came together that were very difficult during that cancer time.
Okay.
Beyond the cancer.
Yeah.
And I just remember the situation happened at church, and it started because of a misunderstanding. It was actually something very small, but we were in a public setting, and my best friend brought out like this long list of things that she had against me, and read it aloud to everybody.
Wow.
And it was a very, very, very painful moment for me.
Yeah.
And right after it happened, I remember going to the downstairs area of the church, and I cried. I cried so hard. And I like to say I wailed, because I had never heard myself cry that way. But what bubbled out of me was such a deep sense of rejection from somebody that I would never have expected it from.
Yeah.
And it just, maybe the accumulation of rejection my whole life kind of just, it all came out in that moment. And so one of the things that happened after all of this happened, when God was using those pause moments to heal my heart, was another group of people who were praying with me. And they were saying, we'd like to invite Jesus into some of your more painful memories. And I immediately thought of that situation, right?
Yeah.
And so in prayer, I basically said, Jesus, I imagined where we were sitting, Ray was there with me at that moment when I was crying.
Yeah.
And he was also with me upstairs when the whole scene happened. So I remembered all of that. And I said, Jesus, where were you when this all happened? Because sometimes when people go through very painful things, they wonder where God was.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, was he removed? Was he aloof? Did he even care? Right? And so in that prayer, when I asked Jesus, where were you when this happened? And he showed me, I was right there with you. I was right beside you. And I said, well, what were you feeling when this happened? And I just felt very clearly Jesus say to me, I felt your pain, and I felt sadness for the way people were treating you. And that was such, I know it sounds so simple, but that was such a deep healing moment in my heart, in my experience, because I realized that God is not aloof when we go through times of suffering.
Yeah.
He's not distant. He's not removed. He's present, and he feels our hurt. He feels the things that we go through.
Yeah.
Right? And I know that healing happened in my heart, and it was a process. It wasn't like just from one day to the next. But I realized years later that as I would remember that event, that I could remember it, but I didn't remember it with the same level of pain that I did before. Before, it just hurt so deeply.
Yeah, it was something you'd avoid or try to, when it would come up, you're just like, this just has to get out of here. But it's almost like now you can stand up to it a bit more and even face it head on and be like, yeah, it happened. It hurts, but it's over.
You don't remember it with the same intensity, right? And that's where I knew that God was healing my heart, is because I could remember it, but not with the same intensity. What was left over was just the sadness that those things happen, but I could still be her friend.
Okay.
But I was just sad that I had gone through that.
Wow.
So I knew that healing had happened in my heart.
So through that healing, you felt that you arrived at the place where you could be her friend again.
I could.
And that had nothing to do with her reaching out or her owning what she had done.
Nope.
Like, that didn't happen?
There was a kind of a very superficial attempt to reconcile on
Yeah.
her part. In fact, I remember a number of times wanting to talk to her and just like, let's just talk this out. Let's just talk through what happened. Like, let's just, restore what's been broken. And she kept saying, no, now's not the time, and she kept pushing it off. And so I had to learn to deal with that in my heart too, right? Because I couldn't expect her to own what she had done.
Yeah.
My responsibility was to forgive.
Wow.
And it was funny because this whole thing about forgiving people who've hurt us, it's a process. It's not an easy step. A lot of times we feel like, no, I have the right to revenge. I have the right to be resentful. What they did is can't be excused.
Yeah.
And
unless they pay the price or they do something to redeem themselves, it's always going to stay there.
But I remember reading that passage that says that if we don't forgive others, God won't forgive us. And I was like, wow, this is serious.
Yeah.
This is serious.
Yeah.
And so then I realized that, so if we're talking about forgiveness, I realized that forgiveness for me began with a choice, not with a feeling.
Right. So you didn't, it's not like you waited till you got to the place that you felt good enough to forgive her.
Exactly. I realized it couldn't start there. It had to begin with a choice. And so it was difficult for me, but I remember just starting with, okay, God, I forgive so-and-so. But forgiveness is saying, God, I forgive so-and-so because what they did caused this to me. And then you acknowledge the pain that it caused.
Right.
And then you say, I choose to forgive her. I choose to forgive him. It begins with that choice. And honestly, there was not a lot of emotion in me for that. I didn't feel like doing it.
Okay.
But the more I did it, the more my heart changed. To the point where, I could see it being a friend again, even though that relationship has never been restored to that point. I knew that in my heart, I was in a position to be a friend again.
So what you brought up is huge, like the obedience piece, where you saw it in God's word. You said, okay, God has told us that if we don't forgive others, he can't forgive us. So out of love for God, out of obedience to him, you began to work at it, even though it didn't feel good, or even though you didn't feel like it. But I'm curious as well, beyond that, were there any other aspects of your relationship with God that helped you in the journey of being able to forgive her?
That's a good question. I think another aspect of that perhaps is the fact that the longer you go through life, the more opportunities that you have to make big mistakes.
Very well put.
Right?
Yeah.
The more you realize that you are just as flawed as the person next to you, the more you realize that you are capable of hurting someone else to the same degree that you've been hurt.
So humbling.
How can you not forgive another person?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Because unless you're just completely, have no self-awareness. But I think life has given me plenty of opportunities to make some very big mistakes and to hurt people deeply. And so I can recognize that I can do damage just like another person can.
Right.
And so it's much easier now for me to forgive another person because I know that I'm capable of doing the same things.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, that's big. And that is a place of self-awareness that you can come to. Because most people, we tend to put ourselves above others. Like, why would they do such a horrible thing to me? I would never do that to them. It's like, well, I've probably done it to other people, come to think of it. Or I'm capable of doing it in the right circumstances.
In fact, maybe this is a good lead into it, but one of the tools that we use here at Willingdon is Freedom Session, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's a fabulous resource. But one of the components of it's a 20-week journey with God, right? To help him deal with the hurts and the things in our life. But one of the important moments of that journey is that we have to take inventory. First of all, it starts with taking inventory of the things that other people have done to us.
Okay. Yeah.
And then we have to exercise forgiveness. Like we go through each one of those and we choose to forgive them for the specific things they've done, right?
Yeah.
The second part of the journey of Freedom Session is that we have to acknowledge what we have done to others.
which maybe feels like a much shorter list until you get to it and you're like, oh my goodness.
Exactly.
I'm way worse to people than they've been to me.
Exactly. But that was my experience. It was so easy for me to remember what other people had done to me that had hurt me. But when it was my turn to acknowledge what I had done to others, I just had to scratch my head like, wow, like what have I done, right?
I'm a monster.
Right? Yeah. But then God starts to unveil things and you realize I have a very long list of things that I need to make amends, that I need to seek restoration for, that I need to ask God's forgiveness for, that I need to ask other people forgiveness for. And so it brings things into balance.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
and puts our own suffering in perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's no longer about my suffering and
The
you know what a big
right. Yeah.
It's about also my faults and flaws and character defects and things where God wants to bring healing in my life, right?
Yeah.
So I recommend Freedom Session for anybody and everybody.
Yeah, yeah. It's not like you have to have gone through any significant experience of recent. Like it applies to pretty much every human being wherever they're at. It's like you'll probably benefit from Freedom Session.
You will, yeah. I mean, it's intense. 20 weeks is it's not a weekend. It takes commitment. It takes hard work.
And a desire, I guess, to get healthy.
Yeah, and it takes vulnerability. Because if you're going to get anything out of it, you have to be honest, and you have to work through things. And so one of the good things about Freedom Session is that you have a sponsor.
Okay.
So you only really have to tell the details of the story that you don't want to tell anybody to one person.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like you have to expose your whole life to everybody.
All these random people in your group.
Right. There's one person that you choose, and it's with that person that you can tell them the things that you might not tell a group, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a certain obviously there's safety in that, but there's also a lot of healing that comes from being able to say things that you haven't had the courage to say, right?
Yeah, totally. Get things into the light. Kind of externalize things that you've carried deep within, just like, hey, they're now, it's almost like they have less of a hold on you now because you've put them out there. Yeah.
And the freedom that comes from that, right? Because the whole object of it is to be set free. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So once you've gone through it, you just feel so much lighter. You almost feel squeaky clean because God has had the opportunity to just go through your life and to address all these things, and you've been able to confess and you've been able to make amends, and it's a really good feeling, right?
That's awesome.
And it gives you the tools for the future, because just because you've dealt with some things doesn't mean that you're not going to have other things.
Yeah,
so
totally.
It gives you the tools to work through, guilt and shame, to identify the difference, and so many tools. So it's really good.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I wanted to quickly dive back to one aspect too of your relationship with God that I think you and I have talked about at one point, just how in the face of such deep rejection and the pain that came from that, you found a great degree of healing in God's acceptance. That it can be easy for us to almost project our rejection onto God. Like when you got cancer, this is so like you, God. It's just like he's almost rejecting you in a sense to say I'm going to punish you. But actually you came to know the character of God who is full of acceptance, which you couldn't really rely on that friend of yours to apologize. You can't even rely necessarily on your spouse or children or loved ones to always accept you and to never reject you. It's like it's truly only God. Maybe can you unpack a bit of that journey for yourself in the healing you received from discovering greater depths of God's accepting character?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of things that I learned about God that I only knew kind of like a textbook God, right? I only knew from maybe what other people had said or things I had read, but I had never actually experienced it in my own life. And so God came alive to me, in a way that he had never been alive before.
You had the right answers before, but that's kind of where it stopped.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe the right answers to give other people who were suffering, but I hadn't experienced it myself.
Right.
So when you're going through suffering, you're keenly aware of what it feels like. You're keenly aware of the pain, and in my case, just sensing God's direct involvement in my life in so many ways, right? Also understanding that he's a God who wants to interact with me. He has a voice.
Right. Yeah, he's not silent.
He's not distant. He's not silent.
Yeah.
And I came away from my cancer experience with just such a completely different perspective of God. He was so much closer than I thought he was. He was so much more involved than I thought he would be.
Yeah.
And he had specific things to say to me because he knew what I needed to hear. And so I could write a book on all of those God moments where God just spoke to me in such comforting, insightful ways, such caring ways that addressed so many of the things that I was feeling.
Yeah. Wow.
And so how could I not understand that he loved me, right? That it would be foolish of me not to reach that conclusion because of all that he had been showing me, all the ways that he had been guiding me, all of the ways that he'd been taking care of me. But I think ultimately there's that saying, how much does God love you? Or how much does Jesus love you? He opened up his arms this wide, like how, I don't know if you know that saying, but basically saying he's already proven that he loves me when he died on the cross. Like the proof is already there.
Yeah, there's no need to convince.
He doesn't have to do anything more.
Yeah.
And that really hit home with me because like I knew that, it was, I'd been taught that my whole life, but I didn't know that. And so that truth finally hit home. He loves me. Now I actually know it in my heart.
Yeah.
Because he's already proven it to me, right? So I don't need further proof that God loves me.
Right. Yeah. He just got you to look back to his
the cross.
Most amazing demonstration.
Yeah, the cross.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Which I had taken for granted.
Right. Well, which is so easy to do for all of us. Yeah. And it's often suffering that would bring that up. Identifying with the suffering of Christ. That's what he came to do for us.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
So I don't know if that answered your question. But
yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. And yeah, even just as we wrap up from here, just for all of our people who are watching this, who are going through suffering, or are about to go through suffering, we don't quite know what comes next in our story all the time. What would be your encouragement for them as someone who has gone through significant seasons of it and clearly experienced God, grown a lot through it? What would you want to say to the people who are just in that space right now of not quite knowing what to do about the suffering that they're experiencing?
I think first of all is to understand that you don't have to do it alone. Sometimes we suffer alone.
Yeah.
You know, we either don't have the courage to come out and tell someone that we're struggling. But I think, first of all, just understand that there are people who are willing to walk with you through this. I've had a number of opportunities in just the last, I would say the last year, last 2 years, to talk to young adults who struggle with suicidal thoughts. To me, that's probably the deepest level of suffering. To get to the point where you want to end it all because you can't cope. And to be able to come alongside of them and say, no, let's just talk. Let's talk through the things that would lead you to think that you would have to end it all. Because I know that voice is not coming from God. God would have life for you. And so I want to walk with you, and I've said that to you, I want to walk with you and help you identify the voice of the enemy that wants to destroy your life, to make you think that things are hopeless, to make you think that there's no way out, that there's no hope. And so that may not be the case for a lot of people, but it just shows that it can reach that level. Right? And so I would just encourage people to just reach out. There's nothing embarrassing about saying you need help. And I think secondly is just be honest with God about what you're going through, and discover Him as your best friend. Right? Jesus wants to be your best friend. The Holy Spirit wants to be your best friend. Like, discover them as friends on this journey. And then I would suggest, use the tools that are available, the resources that are available here at Willingdon. And I mean, there are resources everywhere, right? To help people on their journey with whatever they're struggling with. Find a support group. Find people to talk to, I think, that could point you in the right direction.
That's huge. And, for yourself, is there ever meaningless suffering or purposeless suffering, or would you say that there's is there purpose behind it?
I think suffering can be wasted.
Okay, maybe unpack that a bit. That's a very interesting comment.
I think suffering can be wasted when we go through it and we're just kicking and fussing and blaming and shouting at God and other people, and we don't understand what God wants to do through it. Then it's wasted suffering, because actually you're just suffering then. Right.
It's almost like our choice, whether we want to rob it of purpose or allow purpose to be brought about from it.
Because a very simple question to ask in a moment of suffering is, God, what do you want to teach me through this? Rather than, why are you allowing this? Or why are you doing this? Is, what do you want? What do you want me to learn from going through this? That's a completely different perspective. Right? But because I think that suffering can always be repurposed, right? God can always take our suffering and use it for good things. And I can vouch for that. I can acknowledge all of the things that God, all of the good things that God has brought out of my times of suffering.
On the other side of it, you can see it so much more clearly, but maybe in the moment it's just kind of this fog of pain and suffering and, okay, God help, but then you're like, oh, wow, He was actually accomplishing some great stuff through that.
So once you've been through an experience of suffering and you've seen how God has used it for good things, when you go into the next one, even though it's hard, maybe even harder, if you can remember how God used it the first time and face it with a different heart attitude, then you're not wasting suffering, and God can use it to transform you and to use you for even greater things. But I like to think that God uses our unique suffering, no matter what area it's in, to help us build bridges between ourselves and other people. Just having cancer has opened the door for me to cross those bridges so many times. God has given me so many opportunities to talk to other people who've had cancer because I've been through it myself. And it's not that I have such great insights, but it does give me a way of connecting.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that when I'm suffering and someone comes alongside of me and is trying to speak things into my life, if they haven't been through what I've been through, I listen and I know that they mean well, but it doesn't mean as much as someone who's been in my shoes, who's been in a similar place, and they are speaking.
Yes.
So it gives them more authority to speak into my life, and I receive it with more authority because they've been there.
Right.
And you'll have your own experiences, right, that God will use for you to build those bridges between other people. And I'll have mine, and each one of us will, we'll have our own experiences that God can use.
That's so inspiring, and that's so good. Like, I like that. Never waste your suffering. Like,
yeah, it doesn't have to be wasted.
Totally, and even listening to the value that God has brought to your suffering, and like you said, to all of our suffering, it just opens up the potential for redemption, for healing, for deep, meaningful relationships to come about through what otherwise would just be a very negative thing. God brings beauty from ashes. He brings positivity out of those deeply painful situations.
Yeah.
That's just
So I can do the same with rejection, with cancer. And right now I'm dealing with hyperthyroidism, right? I've been dealing with it for 2 years. But it's just one more invitation to say, okay, God, what do you want to teach me through this? And what path do you want me to take in terms of healing?
Yeah.
And I know that I've already connected with other people who have thyroid issues, and how that it's been an opportunity for me to share what God is teaching me through this, right? So it doesn't have to be wasted.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Wow. And I just want to say thank you again so much for taking the time, knowing that you are still dealing with some health challenges. It's not like you are in perfect health now, sharing this like, oh yeah, God completely healed me of everything and I'm just strong and full of, you're like, no, there's still a journey and there's still lessons to be learned. And so just a huge thank you, Judy, for being open and taking the time to share these things.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Great.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Oh, such an honor.